All right, so just to continue with the story, basically, this is a time around 2020 when I kind of went from being a right winger back to being a left winger. So my whole life, like I said, I was a communist. Then around 2014, I became a right winger, nationalist, pro-white. Then 2015, I went back to being a communist, leftist, anti-white. Then 2016 to 2020, I became a right-winger nationalist, pro-white, and then in 2020, I went back to being a leftist communist, and and kind of anti-white. But like I said, I'll say also though, I just became very confused. But I became a communist again, and I'll get to kind of what happened. But I'll kind of describe how my grandpa kind of confused me and how all that occurred. So, and my grandpa was kind of teaching me things like. Like I said, one thing that he taught me was like, I asked him, hey, men and women, why is it that women tend to, be more into even when they're babies, they tend to be more into dolls, whereas boys tend to be more into, guns and trains and cars. And, is it because women tend to be more feeling oriented and men more doing, right? My grandpa was like, no, I think it's more has to do with, society and culture and how the parents pushed them into that. So I was like, okay, that seems kind of leftist, kind of communist. Like, okay, if we just change the environment, we'll change people, then we're all equal. But really, it's just the environment that affects things. And remember, but this is the thing is, I don't know if my grandpa was that way because I was like I mentioned, I was a big time communist leftist my whole life, and I never really explained to him how I would move back from being communist to nationalist. But when I was a communist, like growing up, anti-white, I remember I was really against the idea of generalizations. Like when in college, I went to visit my grandpa, and during that time, I was a big time leftist, communist, anti-white person. And I remember my grandpa said something in one of his church sermons where he was like, women tend to be more relationship oriented and men tend to be more, doing oriented. And that's why women tend to go to church more often. And because there was more women who went to my grandpa's church that day, my grandpa gave a sermon. And I remember after the sermon, I was really mad at my grandpa. And I was like, Grandpa, you made generalizations about men and women, and you should treat people as individuals. And, and the reason why I look back at it was because I was anti-white. I remember my main thing was like, I wanted to think like, yeah, black people and white people, there is no real differences. And black people could be just as smart as white people and do just as good. It just has to do with society and culture. And, and also the Pygmalion effect, the stereotype effect and stuff like that. And really black people and white people are equal. And I wanted to also, carry that over to men and women and everything, right? But really I had a leftist agenda, and I wanted, black people and white people to mix. And I want to be like, yeah, it's a social construction. Gender is a social construction. Race is a social construction. That's the way I was. And I told my grandpa that. And then my grandpa I don't know if my grandpa kind of started to like be like, oh, I want to, fit in with Ryan, and that's the progressive, popular way to be. And, maybe I'll start taking on that way of thinking. I don't know if that's what my grandpa did, or if maybe my grandpa really did think that way. But, regardless, my grandpa would be like, well, I don't believe it. That's just my framework of understanding because, I don't believe anything, because if you believe, then you're not in the flow because you're attached. So I don't really believe it, but that's my current framework of understanding. But his current framework of understanding was a leftist way of looking at things, right? So, but at that time, I was becoming a right winger again. So I was confused. I was like, I really think that a lot of the differences between people is natural and it's innate and it's born. But then my grandpa, though, he and I didn't want white people and black people to mix anymore. I didn't want to destroy the white race anymore. Remember, like, I think the main thing was I saw myself as Jewish and I wanted to destroy white people. And I saw white people as the biggest risk to Jews and everything. And I saw, the Nazis as evil, right? So I was like, yeah, I want them to mix. So, but at this time, like, I wanted to think like, yeah, there is differences between black people and white people. There is differences. Like, we don't need a mix, and there's differences. Like, let's acknowledge it. And at the time, I also thought that white people had more swag flow. So I was just like, yeah, obviously there is some black people who act more white and white people who are more black, and, black people with higher IQs and white people. But I was like, but generally there's differences. And and not everybody in one group is the same, but, there is differences between groups, and we're not equal, and race isn't necessarily a social construction, and gender isn't necessarily social construction. There is genetic differences. For example, like, in black people, the reason why they say it's a social construction is there's so much genetic diversity among black people compared to, white people, but there's different theories about why. The naturalist theory is, well, because everybody came out of Africa, but that again, there could be an agenda behind that. We don't know if that's necessarily true. We really don't. And there's other people who say other things, like the Atlantis theory and other stuff like that. And I'm not going to necessarily subscribe to any of them, but I'm just saying that regardless of what you believe, there's agendas behind it. And, maybe there's a materialist, naturalist, anti-white agenda behind being like, oh, everyone comes out of Africa and Africa is, superior, and, that type of thing, right? But when I was an anti-white person, that's what I wanted to believe. And I wanted to be like, oh, yeah, white people are all inbred and, and race and social construction, let's all mix. But anyways, it's not necessarily a social construction. There's the reason why they say that is because if you take an average black person and an average black person, they likely will have more genetic distinction, apparently, according to the scientists, than if you get an average white person and an average white person. So they say, well, then why would you say that those black people are of a different race than the white people? And then they say, see, it's a social construction. But again, there's an agenda behind that. And you're not going into details and specifics of what you mean by social construction. Yes, there is differences between races, right? But my point is, or maybe not. Maybe that's again, it could be my agenda. I could have a ego agenda, and I might not be seeing things as it really is. But my point is, when I wanted to see things as social construction, I wanted race mixing. I wanted white people to mix. But anyways, my grandpa at this point, he was confusing me because he starts sort of subscribing to that leftist way of seeing things. And also my grandpa was starting to teach me this thing, like, but this is a right-wing thing. He'd be like, take responsibility for everything. And he'd be like, regardless, the way that I look at it, you don't want to blame anything. You don't want to blame genetics. All you want to do is you want to just go all out, and you want to, be in the flow and upgrade your software toward mutual participation and transpersonal consciousness. And that's all you can do. And just increase your comprehensivity and your passion. And, that's all. So don't make excuses. Don't make excuses. Oh, I do this because I'm a man, or, oh, I do this because I'm a woman. Those are excuses. Those are self-confirmatory. You want to just go all out, because when you go all out and you're in creative projects, you lose yourself and you're in the flow, and that's what you want to do. So my grandpa, again, he's like a human potential guy. It's things like motivational speaker. Be in the now, be in the eternal moment, and just go all out. And I'm like, well, grandpa, I want to know the truth. Do you think that there's, differences? Well, no, there is women who are very good, because this is the way I was. I used to always be like, yeah, grandpa, there's women who are very good at math, or who are not relationship oriented. And there's men who are not, good at math and stuff. And these are generalizations. But again, like, this is what the people on Fresh and Fit talk about. They're like, yeah, but those are generalizations. For the most part, most women are that way and most men are this way, right? And there is differences. And to deny the differences isn't to see the truth. And I think my grandpa would even admit that, like, in the flow, you would see things as they really are. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be like, grandpa, well, okay, of course there's some generalizations, and you could be being judgmental and not saying things as they actually are. Like I said, one of the things my grandpa would teach is, like, if you're judgmental, you're speaking from emotion and your ego, and you're not discerning. There's a difference between judgment and discernment. Discernment is seeing the truth. But my point is, I wanted to just see the truth, and I want to be like, grandpa, let's look at this, like, objectively as we can. And is there differences between men and women? And maybe there is these biological differences. People talk about there is brain differences between men and women, and in general, of course, there's going to be exceptions to the rule in everything. And there's going to be, there's going to be variation in a continuum and everything, right? And there's going to be a bell curve and everything. But there is generalizations also. Like, the average black IQ is 100 or is 85. The average white IQ is 105. The average Asian IQ is 110. But also there's details and specifics in that. Well, the average white distribution is a lot longer, so there's more white geniuses than Asian geniuses because the bell curve is longer. Okay, so stuff like that, right? That's what I'm talking about let's get to the truth of the matter, not just be like, oh, well, it's generalizations. And no, I want to get to the truth. I want to see the things as they truly are, right? And that's, even my grandpa would say, that's the flow. But my grandpa was like, well, it doesn't matter, if you're in the flow, you don't care about your IQ, or you don't care about if you're a man or a woman, you don't even think about the self. And it says in the Bible, in Christ, there is no man or woman or male or female or Jew or Greek, because that means that when you're in the flow, you lose yourself. And a part of losing yourself is just going all out and not focusing on the self and just, losing yourself. And, so he's like, he's, and I understand what he's trying to say. So, but that's my grandpa's point. He's like, well, don't blame genetics. So my grandpa never liked the idea of genetics. And this is the type of stuff where I'm going to get, is it started to confuse me a little bit. So later I would ask my grandpa stuff like, hey grandpa, so like, what do you think about, people say that genetically, cancer is in big part genetic. And a lot of people who get cancer, it's because of genetics. And my grandpa would be like, I don't believe that. And I'd be like, why though? But that's what the scientists are saying. But again, they might have agendas, so I don't know. But my grandpa, now I know, and I didn't know at the time because I didn't start studying Dr. Hora, and this is like 2019 time up. But I didn't start studying Dr. Hora. But Dr. Hora was a very new age person, very new age. And his whole thing was like, no, everything is mental and everything is from thoughts. And this reality is an illusion. And in his point of view, cancer comes from existentially invalid thoughts and stuff like that. And, everything, he thought that everything comes from thoughts. If there was a hurricane, it was because you had existentially invalid thoughts. And my grandpa, would try to tone it down, like I said. Like my grandpa was like very new age, but also rationalistic and naturalistic combination. So Dr. Hora, my grandpa got his PhD at learning under Dr. Hora, but my grandpa toned it down a lot. So my grandpa would be like, well, no, I don't believe that your thoughts really do create the hurricane and all that. But, you can choose to experience the hurricane. So there can be a hurricane and you can allow your thought, you can choose to experience it or not. And, but also my grandpa would be like, if you really are in the flow, you can manipulate energy. And everything is one, so you can manipulate the energy. And yeah, you can maybe, change your hurricane and stuff like that, right? But, the way I saw it, though, was my grandpa made it very rationalistic and naturalistic. But the way I saw it is reality is more like a dream. And this is the way Dr. Hora saw it. Like, reality is more like a dream. And it is kind of more like an illusion. But my grandpa didn't subscribe to that. Like, Dr. Hora was more of a Platonist. Like, this world's a projection of a world of forms type of thing. And that's the way I always saw things. And I think the quadrant model kind of validated that. This reality is a reflection of the quadrant pattern, the ultimate true form, right? The ultimate form of the good, the cross, a quadrant. But my grandpa was more like, well, I don't believe that. I don't understand that stuff. I think everything is energy. And my grandpa's very naturalistic. Like, I think it, probably came from a quantum fluctuation. And he tried to make everything very scientific. But again, like, I like that stuff because, when my grandpa talked about that, it was anti-religion. And I didn't like religion because I thought religion was white supremacist. And, and I wanted to mix the white people. But my point is, like, I'm a lot of tangents right now. But my point is, my grandpa was like, I don't believe it in the, that cancer comes from genetics. And he was like, I don't really subscribe to that. And I'm like, but why? And now I understand, because my grandpa would be like, well, because you don't want to resign to genetics. You don't want to just give up and make excuses. And, because if you say it's genetic, then you don't have any responsibility in the matter. But, the way that because he's an existentialist metapsychiatry, and that's the way Dr. Hora was. Dr. Hora's like, yeah, you create everything. It's all you. And apparently that's what existentialism is in a way. It's like you have complete free will. And that's supposed to give you existential angst, right? But that's why my grandpa's like, yeah, like, no, in a way, Dr. Hora took it to extreme. He's very new age. You create everything. But my grandpa toned it down, but still my grandpa was like, well, you don't necessarily create the hurricane, but, you choose how you deal with it. Like, one example was like, I watched the movie, The Secret with my grandpa. My grandpa was like, well, yeah, in The Secret, they say that your thoughts create the parking space. The guy's driving, he's looking for a parking space, and his thoughts make the parking space open up. But my grandpa's like, that's magical thinking. Because my grandpa, he's new age, but he tried to make it naturalistic and rationalistic. And, Dr. Hora probably would have said, yeah, you do create the space. And that's who my grandpa learned under. And that's who he got his PhD under. But my grandpa would be like, well, you don't create the space, but, you make it possible by having that optimistic attitude. You're going to keep looking and eventually you'll find the space. Or like, in the movie The Secret, there's this like example where there's this guy who thought about having a mansion, and he got a mansion. And according, Dr. Hora would probably subscribe to that. Like, yeah, you know, his thoughts created the mansion. But my grandpa would be like, well, that's magical thinking. But, you know, if you really, you know, if you have those thoughts though, and, you know, you have that goal and you're thinking in that way, that can raise your level of aliveness, and it can raise your, you know, your AQ, your aliveness quotient. And then you're going to go all out, and then you will make it, and then that will make it possible for you to get a house like that. So yeah, there is some truth to it. So my grandpa would make the new age, but make it very rationalistic, right? And naturalistic. But my point though is like, you know, so my grandpa would be like, yeah, you know, but when my grandpa would talk about this stuff, again, I would think it was right wing and Nazi like. But again, I'd become a right winger at this time. I'd become more Nazi like. So I'd be like, yeah, okay. So my grandpa's like, yeah, you know, you create the cancer. You know, it's your thoughts. And I don't want to say it's genetics, because then you can resign to that. No, it's you. So like, you take responsibility for everything. Even if you get cancer, you take responsibility. It was somehow related to your existentially invalid thoughts, because my grandpa would be like, you know, everything is energy. So, you know, and cancer, and my grandpa would use like the new age mumbo jumbo, right? Well, the cancer is due to obstructions of energy in your body. And since everything is energy, if you're not in the flow, yes, it can create cancer, you know? So it's like, but when my grandpa would be talking about that, I'd be like, no, I would think like, yeah, this is right wing, this is victim blaming, right wing, white supremacist type of stuff. Like, oh, the victims, they're to blame for the bad things that happen to them, and the people who are successful, they're successful because of their thoughts. So like, it's extolling the victors and blaming the victims. That's the way I always saw it, and I always saw it as white supremacist. And I didn't like it. And I always saw spiritual people as like that. Like, oh, it's your thoughts, it's your energy, your thoughts create it. And I was like, oh yeah, these people are just white supremacists. And they don't, and they're simplistic. They don't really understand reality. And, and also the other thing was, I remember I told my grandpa, like, you know, my grandpa would be like, yeah, you know, as an existentialist, he thought that, you know, taking responsibility was the best. And I just started understanding in 2020 how my grandpa was an existentialist, and I'll get to that. And why he thought that, you know, that you should take responsibility for everything. And because before that I was confused, like, why does my grandpa, you know, subscribe to that? But what was I saying? So, but my point is, like, at that time, my grandpa was like, yeah, you know, you want to take responsibility for everything. You don't want to blame anything. You know, but again, like, I thought that this was white supremacist victim blaming, and yeah, that's basically it. I was gonna say something, but I forget where I was gonna go with this. But yeah, but I was, for a long time I was confused, and I was like, why does my grandpa believe that this stuff? Like, it doesn't make sense. But now I understand it's because he was an existentialist type of thing. But I thought it was kind of. I thought it was kind of stupid, so I remember one time I told my grandpa, like, I don't think that you have responsibility for everything. I was like, and one example is the quadrant model. I'm like, do you have responsibility for the fact that things are organized in the quadrant pattern? I'm like, to me, the ultimate controller and organizing principle in this reality is the quadrant pattern, and reality seems to conform to the quadrant pattern, and not necessarily to people's thoughts. Like, it's conforming to the quadrant pattern in the grand scheme. So I was like, yeah, obviously people have it seems like people have some free will. Like, I can choose right now to go left or go right. And there's a degree to free will that I think I have there. But I'm like, but at the same time, like, it seems in the grand scheme, there is some sort of like predestination type of thing through the quadrant pattern. But my grandpa was like, I remember he looked down upon me. First off, he didn't believe the quadrant pattern. He thought the quadrant pattern was bogus. He told me it was bullshit. And he was like, yeah, you know, I remember he was like very judgmental about it. And I think it's so ironic because my grandpa talks like, oh, be in the flow and don't be judgmental. But he's always judgmental and he always thinks he knows everything. But he's always like, oh, I don't know anything. I'm in the flow. But I'm like, dude, you seem like so arrogant in my opinion. But he's like, I remember when I told him, like, I think that, you know, it's very likely that things are predestined and it's not, you don't have free will with everything. And you don't take, like, I don't know if you should take responsibility for everything. And I thought it was even unhealthy to take responsibility for everything. And I thought that was kind of like what my grandpa kind of encouraged my parents to kind of do that with me and do that victim blaming thing with me with the shoot away and like, oh, you should take responsibility. And it, like, I thought it made things worse. I was like, it's unhealthy, actually. It could be very harmful, your philosophy. But my grandpa, I remember when I told him that I thought that, you know, things were predestined through the quadrant pattern and stuff, my grandpa like looked down at me for that. He was like, oh, like, geez, you don't know the truth. But in my grandpa's view, he was like, yeah, in the flow, you just go all out and, you know, you don't subscribe to genetics and you just lose yourself and you're not focused on yourself. You're not thinking about genes. But in my mind, I was like, well, the flow, another part of the flow would be seeing the truth the way it is. And some aspects of things are genes, are genetic and stuff. But my grandpa would later be like, well, it could be, yeah, there is some things that are genetic. But if you're in the flow, if you're, you know, you don't resign to the genetics. You just go all out. And yes, you know, and you upgrade your software. And he said, I think that people who want to be like, oh, you know, it's genetics, they just use excuses. And then they excuse existentially invalid behavior. And say like, oh, it's because of genetics, because I'm a man or because I'm a woman, as opposed to just going all out and just being in the flow and, you know, inquiry and losing yourself and creativity. And so, like, again, like, to me, my opinion, like, my grandpa's very human potential oriented, like, you know, Fritz Perls and that type of psychologist, like, yeah, just be in the moment, go all out, and human potential type of thing. But, okay, so I'm going to expand more in my next talk.